All right.
Say, Tim, you might want to turn off the lectern. So last week we had the simulation by Kathy Chatelaine. Did you get much out of that? Did you learn something? Okay. Do you remember what Title 41 is? I heard some talk about it on the news. It's going back and forth in the courts. That was the thing that was passed. It said during COVID, they didn't have to allow asylum into the United States for certain kinds of refugees. So it's interesting. Some of the terms and concepts she talks about, hopefully when you hear things discussed in the news, you'll have more insight. How many of you know the Catholic priest in town? How many of you have seen him or met him before? Okay. What can you tell me about Father John? He's nice. Is he short? Is he tall? He's tall. Okay. Do you know where he's from? Okay. He's from Sudan. And he's a refugee. He had to flee Sudan and walk hundreds of miles to another country to try to get out because of war in Sudan. So it's interesting, right here in Byron at the Catholic Church, we have a refugee from Africa who is their priest. Nice guy. So today we're going to be talking about King David. And there's a lot of different directions to go. It's amazing for someone 3,000 years ago how much detail there is in the stories. But before we do that, I want to just go back and review a bit on where we're at to understand why David was important in the history of Israel. God made Adam and Eve and all creation. He said it was very good. He said the creation was good. Adam and Eve were very good. They rebelled against him. They were banished from the garden. Their relationship with God was broken, with each other was broken, with themselves was broken, with nature was broken because of sin. Eventually, God works through Abraham and kind of lays out his plan for what he's going to do in the world and what he's going to do through Abraham and his descendants. He's going to give him land, give him a child. He's going to make his name great. And through him, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. That's Abraham. Abraham is Isaac, and then Jacob. And then Jacob has 12 sons, and there's a famine in the land. So they end up being refugees in Egypt. They had to leave their homeland to go to a place where they could eat, and Joseph was there. After being in Egypt, at first everything was good. Eventually it went bad. They cried out to God to deliver them. God sent Moses. Moses had the plagues with Pharaoh, brought them out of Egypt, and they were going back to the land of Israel, or the land that God promised Abraham. On the way, there's some glitches. They receive the commandments on Mount Sinai. They worship a golden calf, and God gets upset and gets close to wanting to destroy them. But Moses says, "You can't do that, God. What are the other nations going to say? They're going to say you made these promises and brought them out and killed them." So Moses has this conversation with God. God changes his mind, but because they made the golden calf and because they were rebellious in the desert, they were there for 40 years. Last week we had Joshua bringing them into the promised land. There was wars, there was battles. Part of it was judgment on the false gods and the immorality of the people. So tonight we kind of pick up with, after they get in the Holy Land, they kind of have regional government and they have judges that kind of run different regions. And after a while, they get tired of it because some of the judges are good, some of them aren't. And they start calling out that they want a king. They want a king like the other nations around them. And God hears that, and at first God is like, what? I'm not your king? Are you rejecting me? But then he says, well, if you get a king, I tell you what's going to happen. They're going to tax you, and they're going to send your children off to fight wars for them. And they're like, we want a king. We want a king. So tonight picks up with Samuel, Saul, and David. Samuel was a prophet. And Samuel, the story with Samuel starts in 1 Samuel chapter 2 with Hannah, who's Samuel's mother. And Hannah is older, she's barren, she can't have kids. And she's begging God to give her a child. And she says, you give me a child and I will dedicate him to you and he will be your servant. And Hannah has a child is Samuel. So Samuel gets to he's a prophet and he anoints the first king of Israel because the people asked for a king, not because God said they should have one. First king was Saul. Starts out okay, and then he's got some real issues, and people try to guess what all was going on there. There's kind of some interesting explanations. He has some, the enemy, the powers of darkness, he's playing with them, and eventually he goes bad. And God talks to Samuel again, and he says, I need you to go to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem. Does that sound familiar? Somebody else born in Bethlehem? That's where David was from. That's his hometown. Jesse was David's dad. And Samuel goes there to anoint a king. First of all, Samuel says to God, if I go to anoint a king and Saul finds out what's going to happen to me, he's going to. And God says, just go, I'll be with you. So he goes and he starts off at Jesse's household, and I think there's 8 or 10 sons. Can somebody tell me where David is in the order of his 8 brothers? Youngest. So they started with the oldest one, and they come, and Samuel says, no, that's not the one. No, that's not the one. Well, eventually they come down to the youngest, and he's out in the fields watching the sheep. And he comes, and Samuel says, he's the one. He's the one. So that was David. Well, the story goes on in Samuel, and maybe this is a good time to play the first video. And this kind of, these videos, sometimes they cover a lot of ground, but they're good. We have one on 1 Samuel that's about 8 minutes, I think, and the other one's about 6 minutes. But we're just going to watch this first one now. Thank you. This is brought to us from BibleProject.com. Thanks, Tim.
The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're 2 separate books in our modern Bibles, but that division is due simply to scroll length. It was originally written as one coherent story. We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came into the Promised Land. And there, Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey the covenant commands. Before the book of Samuel, Judges showed how Israel failed at that task big time. It was a period of moral chaos, and it showed Israel's need for wise joy, she sings this amazing poem in chapter 2. And the poem is all about how God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, about how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. And also it's about how God will one day raise up an anointed king for his people. Now Hannah's poem has been placed here at the beginning of the book to introduce these key themes that we're going to see throughout the whole story, like the next one. Samuel grows up and becomes a great prophet and leader for the people of Israel, at the same time that the Philistines rise to power as Israel's arch nemesis. And in this crucial battle, the Israelites get arrogant, and instead of praying and asking God for help, they trot out the Ark of the Covenant as this kind of magic trophy that will automatically grant them victory in battle. And so because of their arrogant presumption, God allows Israel to lose the battle, and the Ark is stolen. So the Philistines, they take the Ark, and they place it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And then the God of Israel defeats the Philistines and the god Dagon without an army by sending plagues on the people. And then the Philistines don't want the Ark anymore, obviously, and they send it back to Israel. And the point of this little story seems to be this: God is not Israel's trophy, and he opposes pride among the Philistines, but also among his own people. And so Israel needs to remain humble and obedient if they want to experience God's covenant blessing, which opens up into the next large section. The Israelites come to Samuel and they say, hey, we want a king like all the other nations have. Go find one for us. And so Samuel, he's kind of ticked off, and he goes to consult with God. And God says, yes, their motives are all wrong, but if a king is what they want, give them one. And so we're introduced to the figure of Saul. Now Saul is a tragic figure because he begins full of promise. He's tall, he's good looking, he's a perfect candidate for a king. But he has deep character flaws. He's dishonest, he lacks integrity, and he seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes. And so these flaws become his downfall. He wins some battles at the beginning, but his flaws run so deep, he eventually disqualifies himself by blatantly disobeying God's commands. And so the aging Samuel confronts Saul and Israel. He had warned the people that they would only benefit from a king who's humble and faithful to God. Otherwise, the kings of Israel will bring ruin. So he informs Saul that God is going to raise up a new king to replace him. And so Saul's downfall begins, as God at the same time is working behind the scenes to raise up that new king. It's an insignificant shepherd boy named David. He's the least likely candidate to be king, but the famous story of David and Goliath shows that God's choice of David is not based on his family status, but simply on his radical and humble trust in the God of Israel. And so this story embodies all of the themes of Hannah's poem. Proud Saul and Goliath are brought low, while humble David is exalted. From here, we watch Saul slowly descend into madness, while David rises to power. So David starts working for Saul as a general, and he's winning all of the battles, and he's also winning all of the fame. And so Saul gets jealous, and he starts chasing David around, hunting him, trying to kill him. David's done nothing wrong, and so David simply runs and waits in the wilderness. And here we see David's true character. He has multiple opportunities to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God will raise up a king for his people. What's interesting, too, is that many of the poems of David that you find in the book of Psalms are linked to this very period of his life, and they all express the same attitude of trust. And so this section of the book ends with Saul coming to a grisly death after losing a battle with the Philistines. 1 Samuel tells some of the most intricate, well-told stories you find anywhere in the Bible, and the characters Saul and David are portrayed very realistically. And the author's putting them forward as character studies so that you can find yourself in them. So in Saul's story, we see a warning. It's crucial that we reflect on our own character flaws and how they harm us and other people. And with God's help, we need to humble ourselves and deal with our dark side so that Saul's story doesn't become ours. David, on the other hand, is presented as an example of patience and trust in God's timing in our lives. And so he's running in the wilderness, being chased by Saul. David had every reason to think that God had abandoned him. But that's not
This weird toolbox replacing gadget is quickly becoming the most popular Christmas gift of 2022. It replaces a...
Thanks, Sam. So we'll watch what happens in 2 Samuel in a bit, but some preview of some things that are happening. It's interesting over the whole history of Israel, some 3,000 years, that the height of their power, their prestige, their security as a nation came under King David. That was the glory years. They weren't in Egypt. They had plenty to eat. They had peace. They had security. They had a spiritual leader who was guiding them to stay close to God. And so all the prophecies that would later come when things fall apart, that God was going to send somebody from the line of David, a king like David, only an eternal king. They would think back of how David was a king and hope eventually that would be what the Messiah would be. But Jesus came to be king of all the nations, not just Israel. And he wasn't there just to beat Israel's enemies, but sin and death and the devil. And so the people of God know these stories, and it shapes what they're looking for eventually when Jesus comes. Now, did they talk about Goliath? It might be Goliath, might be coming up in the next video, but I just wanted to say when we lived in Madagascar, do you remember Jill, the guy with the slingshot? That your dad was, maybe you weren't there. It was in Fort Dauphin. So there was a guy there. He was a guard for the missionaries. There was a school there that he was guarding too. And he had a leather strap about this long. And he had a rock that was about this big, a little smaller than a baseball. And he took his sling and he'd whip it around twice and just with his whole body throw it. And that rock went pretty hard at somebody. And if you hit somebody in the head with that, they'd be knocked out. And I say that because, that's what happened with David. He does an errand and goes and helps Saul. And there's this fight going on with the Philistines, and Goliath is like, hey, just beat me and we'll go home. And nobody's courageous enough to take him on until David, who's bringing lunch to the army, says, I'll take him on. And he says in there clearly, it's you have insulted God, and God is with me, and you're in trouble. And of course, he laughs. David puts his armor on. This is in our reading for today. What was it? 1 Samuel 17 and 18 or something like that? 16 and 17. Thank you. So it's really good reading, but he puts the armor on and he's like, this is just getting in the way. I don't fight with armor on. But, he did say to Goliath too, and he said to the other people, it said he was crazy. I as a shepherd, I have beat off animals that were trying to get to the sheep. So I know how to deal with trouble. And so he takes on Goliath and kills him. And then that's part of his being a warrior. He was a good military commander, a good king. And again, this was the glory years for Israel. And if they could turn the clock back to any time, it would be back to then. David, though, falls, and this will be a good summary coming up in the next video, but do you remember the name? There was a woman that David got kind of entangled with. Do you remember the name of the gal that he laid with and got pregnant? It wasn't his wife. Somebody remembers. What's that? He's thinking. That's Bathsheba. So David is out on his roof and he sees Bathsheba taking a bath, and he's like, I think I want to get to know her a little bit. And he's king, so he sends somebody over there and they lay together and she gets pregnant. Well, she's married and not to the king. So David's like, well, what am I going to do now? And he finds out her husband's name, and he's off fighting the Philistines or fighting somebody, and he brings him back from the battle and suggests he take a break. And he's hoping that he's going to be with his wife so that when they have the baby, it's all going to work out just fine. But Uriah doesn't do that. And David tries again a second night. And Uriah's like, I can't be having fun when my army is fighting in battle. I have to be there for them. And so then what David says is send Uriah to the front line where he is likely going to be killed. And then he was killed. And then I'm not sure who it was talked to David about a farmer who had a whole bunch of sheep, and about a poor farmer that had one lamb. And the guy's saying to him, he tells David about this, and David's really mad because the guy with all the sheep took the lamb away from the guy that only had one. And David's all hopping, indignant and everything, and the prophet says, you're the one. It's you I'm talking about. And, to speak truth to the most powerful person around, that takes a lot of courage. And at that point, then David admits that he messed up, and he messed up big time. So I want to read from Psalm. You can turn in your Bibles. If I can find my sheet. Well, it's Psalm 20. Well, we're going to go Psalm 51 first. I had the page number on there. Remember, find Psalm it's usually exactly in the middle of your Bibles. Psalm 51 was lightly written after David was found out for killing this military commander, having an adulterous relationship, and then killing the husband of the gal who was having the baby. So Psalm 51, it's on page 585. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you alone have I sinned and done what's evil in your sight, so that you're justified in your sentence and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. And it goes on, and in verse 10, create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. So that's his prayer of confession, a prayer from David. Now, another psalm I wanted us to look at is Psalm 23. David is in the wilderness, and the king wants to kill him. So I want you to think, if you're running for your life from a rich and powerful king, what would your prayers be? What would you pray to God? And Psalm 23 was likely written in this context. Remember, David is a shepherd. So that's page 567, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley or the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. So think about it. He's going to sleep at night knowing there's people that are trying to kill him. And he says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And then this last part of the psalm, a lot of people don't get, and it's hard to get the first time, but you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. It's like you're not embarrassed to be my friend. The people who hate me, you'll sit down and have a meal with me right in front of them, and you will bless me. And he says, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So David is a leader. He's a flawed leader, and yet God works through him anyway. And one of the themes tonight is to be a leader like David and not like Saul, but to see how God is bigger than the people he's working with, and he works with imperfect people. And David was forgiven, but there was consequences. He wanted to build a temple for God, and God said, no, I'm sorry. And eventually Solomon built a temple. And if you go to Jerusalem today, you can see stones from the temple that was built 3,000 years ago. They are huge, huge stones, like as tall as stained glass window to the floor. And from that cement over to here, I mean, they're just huge. But David didn't build that. Solomon built it. Why don't you run that second video and then we'll break. Remember, this is 3,000 years ago.
Check out the
So that's a lot in these videos, and I don't expect you to remember all of it, but I want you to see that there's connections and that God is at work in all these details through leaders that are imperfect. And God continues to be at work in the world through his people, the church, through you, to reach out to bless everyone on the planet. So I'll say a prayer and then we'll do the Apostles' Creed. God, we thank you for David, and we thank you for all you teach us, the details of relationships 3,000 years ago. But the most important thing is you are Lord. You love your people, and you work for our good. And help us to trust that when things are going well, and help us to especially trust it when things are falling apart. We ask this in your name. Amen. Then stand. Do you believe in God the Father? In Jesus Christ, the Son of God? That was impressive. I think that's the best I've heard so far. It was really nice, if you know it, not to go too fast. Say it together. So thanks.